What's up, strength coaches? Welcome back to another episode of the Cheeky Midweeky, where we are making strength and conditioning not boring anymore. In today's episode, we have Marc Lewis on the show from the NFL Houston Texans. Marc, thanks for joining us, man, and go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners out there.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you having me, Justin. Well, currently I'm the director of applied sports science with the Houston Texans. Um, Previously, was at Penn State as the associate director of performance science there, and before Penn State, I was at Virginia Tech as the assistant director of strength conditioning for football and the director of sports science. A little bit of my background educationally, my PhD is in exercise physiology from Virginia Tech. I did a master's degree in epidemiology there as well, a master's in exercise physiology, and then a undergrad in exercise science from Wake Forest University. And so, very much physiology background. Then got more into the data world, the world of statistics, and applied epidemiology once I got in grad school.
You and I talked before we filmed this last week about it, but how do you feel that the world of strength and conditioning is evolving with too much technology in for the bad, right? Like it's very useful, and we're going to talk about the usefulness of it, but we've also talked before where the pendulum might have almost swung too far, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times I find myself talking to a lot of strength coaches that are getting technology for the first time, and a lot of times it's been given to them or provided to them whether they wanted to or not, or whether they wanted to have it or not. And you're provided with technology before doing all the prep work, and you can get consumed and drowned in data, and to the point where that you're not even quite sure what you're looking at. And so I think you know it's really important, prior to getting technology to really be to understand what gap in information are you filling, what questions do you have this tool or this instrument might be able to help you answer, and long term or downstream, I should say, how is this information going to be informing decision making. And so, being able to have all of those questions answered and those checked, so to speak, prior to getting technology. I think right now there's just really it's been this way the last 5 to 7 years as new technologies come out, and as more and more people have it, it's keeping up with the Joneses of we need catapult because this team has it, or we need force plates because this team has it in our conference, or whatever it is for recruiting purposes if it's collegiate level. I think being very intentional and purposeful with new technology that you bring into your setting, into your organization, I think is really important. The other kind of area that gets overlooked a lot of times is the infrastructure to collect, manage, then analyze and report the data, because
Mm,
that
yep.
those processes are time consuming. It takes certain skills that individuals may or may not have, and we always talk about it. The output or the data that you're getting, that you're analyzing, that you're looking at is only as good as the information being collected, the data being collected. So if you don't have people that know what they're doing, and you haven't been very methodical in setting up how your data is going to be collected to make it as reliable as possible, to make sure that it's repeatable and scalable. If you're in the collegiate sector, is another big one. Um, those factors are very important to consider prior to bringing new technology in, because ultimately, if the data you're collecting is not being collected in a way that's makes it reliable and high quality, and it's not something that's repeatable on a daily, weekly, whatever basis this is going to be, based on the questions you're answering, then the output you get from that information isn't going to be worth anything, and could potentially cause more issues than it actually helps.
Amen. I mean, we said it, and we're going to say it again here. Like, no data is better than bad data, and I feel like so many strength coaches out there probably have bad data because they just needed to get it collected and hurry up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes there's this thought that, okay, I have a set of force plates and we're going to do something simple like a counter movement jump. Okay, great. That's a low skill, very simple test. Force plates are fairly easy to manage. However, you know, you have to be very thoughtful about how you're going to do this. So what time are you going to collect this information? What's going to be the frequency with which you collect this information? The individual's testing. Are you going to have standard cues? Because we know from the literature
Yep.
that different cues
Yep.
result in different outputs. So if you've got, let's say you're say, okay, interns can do it. Okay, great. Well, they may be able to do it, but is there going to be a written out methods of how they're what exactly they're going to say, and making sure that they say the same thing to every individual, and that everyone that's doing that is doing it the same way. Um, and if so, great. But those are things you have to think about beforehand, because based on the cueing, based on how that movement's being coached, then you can have data that's unreliable, session to session, or even within the session. And so I think, you know, right there are several questions that you as a strength coach have to think about and consider prior to doing something as simple as saying we're going to do a counter movement jump on a force plate every week.
And
And
it's
then
not a. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and then the second part of that is you have the data.
Taking a quick break from the show to tell you about our deal we have going on right now in December. If you sign up for Fundamentals Level 1, you will get 1 free year at Strength Coach Network. That's right. Sign up for Fundamentals, our 20-hour long-form education course that has information on every topic in strength and conditioning that will make you a better strength coach, regardless of the field that you're in. Not only if you're a strength coach, personal trainer, athletic trainer, physio, this is for you because all the education about progressions, regressions, motor learning, speed, agility, jumps, you name it, we have information in it. So sign up for Fundamentals, get a free year at Strength Coach Network. Click the link down below. Let's get back to the show.
Then how are you going to manage it, and how are you going to set up efficient processes to actually analyze and report that information that doesn't require you, taking 3 hours out of your day to manually, look at this information and go over the numbers and understand and decide what metrics you're going to look at, and the processes of how you're going to determine selecting those metrics.
Yeah, not like you said, getting back to the methodology of it, what's going to be the prescribed amount of rest in between each rep if you're doing multiple reps, right? And then
Exactly.
within that, like, I think that's what can make the research world in athletics so difficult is if you need to have these clean methodologies, but if you're trying to get exercise and testing done in the middle of exercise, well, they're not just going to stand around and do nothing. They might go do another set of something and come back to you, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of integrating your testing or your monitoring into your training. It should be, training's testing, testing's training. It should be You should be able to do that, not with force plates, with Nord boards, with 1080s, whatever technology, and it should be integrated. In my opinion. Otherwise, I think you run into a whole other host of issues.
Yeah.
And so I think integrating it into training is great, but that's where you have to think about, what's going to be, what questions am I answering? How's this information going to help do that? And then what's the best way to collect this information to answer those questions? And then being able to set it up, because that's going to impact how many trials you're doing, the reps you're doing, when you're doing it within the training session, the frequency with which you're doing it. And all of those different considerations need to be thought about. And I think that's, the methodology to what to your point. I think when you get into that, it should be recipe like a cookbook. Like,
Yeah.
you should have, this is the way we do a counter movement jump. This is the way we do a drop jump. This is the way we do a single leg counter movement jump. All of those things, from the cueing to the setup to the rest periods, should all be done. And the warm up or whatever you're doing, like if you decide I'm
Shoot.
going to do a counter movement jump, to look at, very popular right now is, okay, we're gonna do a counter movement jump once a week, every Monday, Tuesday, to look at neuromuscular fatigue during the season, to help, intervene if we need to on guys that maybe are experiencing a lot of residual fatigue outside of their norms. Okay, great. But with that though, you need to understand, okay, well, we need to place it at a time that's going to be repeatable every week, to be able to compare a Monday to a Monday over
That's so
time,
true.
and to be able to know a guy. Because
Yep.
if one day you do it after movement prep, before a main lift, and the next week, you have to flex it to, okay, well, some things change. We're going to do it at the end of the lift. That, I mean, those numbers aren't going to really be comparable. You're not comparing apples to apples, depending on what you did leading up to that within that lift, and putting it at the end of the lift versus putting it at the beginning of the lift, or before a primary movement or after a primary movement. I mean, I can tell you right now that if you put something as simple as putting the counter movement jump before a primary lower body lift or after that lower body lift is going to increase the coefficient of variation of your numbers within that session. And so if you did 3 jumps before the primary lift and then 3 jumps after the primary lift, same day, same everything, those numbers, the variation within that's going to be much higher, versus if you do it before and then you always do it before, that variation is going to be so much lower. But just the placement of before or after one lift can have a lot of impact on the variation and the error you're seeing. And the reason that's important is because the more error you have, the more difficult it is to actually see real change when it does happen.
Amen to that. How do you then how do you best recommend practice to the coaches out there that heard you and they're like, oh, well, what should I do?
Sure. In an example of monitoring neuromuscular fatigue, I would determine where within your week is it most appropriate. Everyone's a little different. Some people, lift and train day after a game. Some people do it 2 days after. Just whatever your schedule is, what's most appropriate. And then within that session, I would select a time where they're warmed up and they're prepared, but they don't have a lot of acute fatigue. So before your primary movements, but after they've been prepped with whatever your framework within your session is like. Generally, you're gonna be doing some type of soft tissue work into ground-based stuff, into walking, into more higher speed, incorporating more velocity into the movement prep, and then you're doing some type of really specific warm-up to whatever your primary movement is that day. That point is generally the best because you've got them warmed up, you've got them ready, potentiated from a neuromuscular standpoint, warmed up, ready to go, and then that's a good time to be able to put that test in where there's not a lot of acute fatigue, but yet they're prepared, they're warmed up, and then keeping it there every week. And if you have to make alterations to your training program, to really touch that last in order to try to make it comparable. And so, because a lot of times a lot of times coaches, they look at that as like if I need to move something, I can always move that wherever and plug it in. And in my way of thinking, it should actually be the opposite because.
What's up, strength coaches? Taking a quick break away from the show to let you know about our membership site. Not only do we at Strength Coach Network put out the Cheeky Midweeky, but we have a membership site where you gain access to a video library and a members-only forum. Inside the video library, you will have access to over 170 different lectures, which equals over 400 hours of content. Inside of these content, it is every sport you could think of and every topic in strength and conditioning. In our members-only forum, we have career advice and we have topics in strength and conditioning where coaches ask each other questions and we help each other inside the network. You can try the network out for 24 hours for $1 if you are not a member. Click the link down below and you will be able to check us out.
You're not going to see as much of a variation or much of an effect on a primary lift, or whether you do a counter movement jump before or after. But if you do that, if you're, let's say, a squat, for example, if you're doing a squat and you do the jump before or after, that's going to have more impact on those jump metrics than that jump is going to have on you moving that weight on a squat. And so, like, your testing, once you set up, like, this is where I believe is most appropriate to place this counter movement jump test. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and that's going to be the last thing I try to touch if I need to move anything around for time constraints or whatever it is. And but that also speaks to how much you have to value that information to help inform your decision making.
Yeah, no. How about anything within maybe some of the hamstring stuff? Do you like to put it in pre, post? How do you recommend it for that?
Well, there's trade-offs to everything. And I think when you get into the world of testing hamstrings and you're dealing with field-based sports where you have where high-speed running, sprinting is a big part of what they're going to be doing, you have to be very careful where you place different types of isolated hamstring testing. Nordic in particular, the Nordic curl. I've been places that have done a lot of different where we've done a lot of different types of testing. I'm a big fan of isoprone,
Yeah,
long
me
lever
too.
isoprone.
Two legs at the same time or one at a time?
I do both at the same time is the way I've always done it. Then
Same.
basically from that, I think one, the data is really reliable. It's not, it doesn't cause as much damage or soreness as generally what you'll get from the Nordic. And it seems to be, again, just from being able to have them, have the athletes in those positions. Generally, you will have less complaints, feedback from your athletes about, any type of discomfort they might have around the knees. That's something in the football world you'll tend to get with the Nordic. I found generally you'll get about 10% of your athletes that complain on doing Nordics on the Nord board from getting some type of pain where around their knees, um, or around the tendon. Um, Again, like, just you always have to consider what your athlete, that trade off of, like, okay, if I can do a test that gives me the same type of information, my athletes might prefer it.
Mm.
Then that's always got to be a consideration as well. So I found the isoprone to be great with that. And then um, and then I can actually send you a video of kind of how I do that as well, if and you can add that to the information in terms of the setup and what that's like in terms of testing.
No, it's interesting you brought that up because that was part of our testing protocol. If somebody had an acute injury, we would just okay, we can't do a full Nord board, but we're like, hey, we could do a prone.
Hmm.
So let's go ahead and put you prone before we're actually
Absolutely.
able to do a Nord board. And that kind of became like, all right, whenever anybody would come in as part of their initial intake, they would do a prone and they would do a Nord board, so we would have it right then and there, and we'd just be able to have those moving standards of that. So it was interesting to hear because I was also playing around with the prone or the ISO 30 and like for me trying to come up with like without pulling out a goniometer how to make sure that you were really getting it right or like and then their hips wouldn't shoot up in the air like getting it in the
Yeah.
right spot, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think the isoprone, to your point, the isoprone much easier to get the athlete in the correct position.
Like you're just there.
Yeah, exactly. And they're less prone to using their hips in that. And so generally, the way that I coach it is have them set up and really have them brace their core like a front plank. And with that, they'll brace their core, which tends to limit their hip movement, even if they want to shoot their hips, especially if they've been, especially depending on if they're used to moving or testing, doing a Nordic curl, like being in the stationary position and just contracting, pulling your heels towards the ceiling, contracting. Little different. They tend to want to move their body, and so if you're going to an ISO, a lot of times just giving them like this is a front plank position, embrace your core, get in a good tight position. Generally, they won't move their hips, and then from that, it's a 3, 2, 1, pull, 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 in terms of the cueing and consistent throughout. And then just always tell them in the setup, we're heels to the ceiling in terms of just like an external type cue.
As you mentioned it with the queuing and standardization of whatnot, did you guys or do you recommend that people do cue effort during it? And then if so, do you guys just standardize like, hey, you only say X, or would you say, one of three different things and you say them at different times? How do you best recommend that?
Sure. I mean, and I'm saying we as in everywhere I've been, like I've kind of had similar, it's kind of been the same way from Virginia Tech, Penn State, everywhere I've been in
Right.
terms of how we cue and kind of the setups there and these different tests that are utilized. But it's, you know, um, the assumption, and then you communicate this with your athletes, assumption is you're giving maximal effort on these tests. The information is only as good
Yeah.
as the effort you get because that is
Yeah.
an assumption that's made
That's a good point.
when you're jump testing, when you're doing these tests, because otherwise the information's not good there. I will say that something like a Nordic curl on a Nord board, that's I have less concern about effort there than I would like an ISO prone. But at the same time, if there was an effort issue, generally that's going to show up in your variation. And I look at variation within the day and also over time. And every now and then you'll get an athlete with a higher variation, and you know that might speak to some days not being consistent in terms of effort. Um, but at the same time, if you're seeing coefficients of variation, intersession coefficients of variation of 4, 3, 5%, you know, they're most likely giving max effort because and not being selective about some days giving little effort, some days they're probably giving pretty good effort because those are really good numbers to have in terms of the limited amount of error or variability there, I should say.
Speaking of variability, I'm not as up to date on the research with it now. What is acceptable within the research for asymmetry if you're looking for something like what's the number that is now all of a sudden causing alarm? Because I feel like it used to be 8%, but then it's like 12. Like it seems like moving goalposts of what is and is not acceptable.
I'm gonna give you the best answer. It depends, because there should not be a threshold that you're looking at, just a blind absolute threshold. And I think those of the listeners that are up on Chris Bishop's work, Matt Jordan's work, um, I think something that's been pretty clear is that you have to consider really a couple of different factors before um, saying that an athlete has an asymmetry, an inner limb imbalance of physical capacity. So, first of all, you have to consider the variation. So, let's say you make your cutoff 8%. Well, if the coefficient of variation of average peak force on the left limb is 7% and the right limb's 11%, then the coefficient of variation of one of your limbs is higher than your threshold. So even if they did have an asymmetry of, let's say, 9%.
Quick break from the show to remind you to hit that like and subscribe button so that way you get notifications of when more content like this gets released. So click that like and subscribe button. And with that, let's get back to the show.
that's that's not gonna that may or may not be real. You don't So it has to depend on, one, the coefficient of variation of left and right limb. And if you're looking at average force, which that's what most people look at, then it's the average force coefficient of variation left limb, average force coefficient of variation of right limb, and your percent of asymmetry has to be greater than both left and right limb coefficient of variation of average force. And then the other piece is directionality needs to be established. And so a lot of times you'll see athletes that flip flop, and so they'll be 6% left limb deficit one week, then they'll be 9% right limb on the next week, and then if you do not have an established directionality, then I think you don't know if that's really a deficit or something that Matt Jordan terms performance variability. Um, Athletes using different strategy, but that's not the same thing as having a true deficit in physical capacity within a limb. And so I think that's important to understand as well. Then the final piece of it is you have to understand that depending on the sport, the position group, there's going to be different population specific asymmetries that are there that are not a bad thing necessarily, but not a bad thing, not a good thing, but exists within that population based on the skills of their sport or position. Again, depending on the sport, depending on if your team sport position group, and so those have to be considered. And so you really have to, if you're going to look at a magnitude threshold, you have to, one, first see if they have an established inner limb asymmetry in their testing using the coefficient of variation of each limb, understanding that, okay, is it consistent with directionality? So over time, is it always left limb and it's consistent? If you don't need to do a statistical analysis. If you were, then I would say to run a kappa coefficient to understand the magnitude of agreement over time. But otherwise, if you have the information visualized in a graph longitudinally, you can see pretty clearly, okay, is every single time, let's say their right limb is their right limb always the one that's below over time, and you've tested consistently over time, then yeah, you can say, okay, that's directionality. They're not flip flopping back and forth every week. And then, so those things have to be considered within the individual. Then the final piece is compare them to their population and see if this is outside the norm of their population, and then understand that within the context of the sport, the technical skills required, and all of those things. If, in football, it's like you got your specialists, Obviously, you're going to see things that are quarterbacks, depending if they're right or left arm and what foot they're planning on, if we're talking about lower body asymmetries. There's going to be so many factors. In baseball, pitchers, are they right-handed, left-handed? Like there's going to be so many factors like that. So population and position specific is important. And then if you're looking at change in asymmetry over time, because maybe you've established they have an asymmetry and it's something you want to address. Let's say you're dealing with a wide receiver and he does a lot of high speed running and you see a 16% asymmetry left directionality. Let's say it's left limb, his coefficients of variation on each limb are below that, and you say this is a real asymmetry and that magnitude, it concerns me, and there's established directionality, it's clear that this person has a left limb deficit in hamstring force production, and I think I should intervene. So let's say you intervene, you do oscillatory isometrics, you do whatever your program is, you do some single leg work, you're eccentrically loading, eccentric RFD type loading, whatever it is. Okay, my intervention point, and I would say a standardized intervention of something you've already come up with on a card and can attest the effectiveness of your intervention. Okay, fine. You see change in that asymmetry. We go back to the same thing in that if you're testing, that change has to be greater than the coefficient of variation to know that the change was real and not just error. And so let's say the change was 6% and the coefficients of variation were 9%, 11%. Well, you don't know if that was real change or just error in your measurement or normal biological variability. So that change has to be greater for you to be like, okay, yes, this was real change and this asymmetry was addressed and reduced. And I know that because of the my change was greater than the variability that you see in the measurement.
Hearing you talk about that made me think about how often in research there is a control group, but typically within athletics there never is a control group. How can we work within that in athletics to make our testing better?
Oh, yeah, I think it's really fundamental in a lot of the things I've mentioned. I think first and foremost, we have to be able to standardize how we do things as well as possible. So things we've talked about, like having a method for how we test so that we know that when we're testing, it's as high quality like as low variability as we can get, because ultimately we want to detect a lot. Athlete monitoring comes down to one big piece that it comes down to is detecting real change when it occurs and understanding the magnitude of that change. So much of the discussion when I talk to folks is meaningful change, and which if you look at that, how it's defined, and, whether it's Mike McEwen or whoever, resources you go to, how that's defined is the smallest amount of practical importance or clinical importance, okay, which is generally tied to some type of effect size, generally 0.2 being the smallest if you're in that world. And so, all right, fine. Well, you have to understand, can we detect real change? And that comes down to, can we collect reliable information that's going to be able to tell us when things change? Okay, whether it's fatigue, whether you want to test, if you're a strength coach and you're testing, I want to see, did my guys get faster and more powerful? Great. That's awesome. That's information that you should have, but it's going to come down to how well can you collect that information to be able to see, did they get better over whatever block you're looking at or whatever time period you're looking at. If you're doing pre, mid, post over the course of a spring or winter training, football, let's keep it in football world, you're going winter training, preparing for spring ball, and you want to know, are your guys getting better based on your program and the outputs that you're trying to get from your program, then you're going to test across these phases and you're going to look in at specific metrics based on what you're trying to improve in that specific block during that specific microcycle, whatever your program looks like. And so with that is going to be, how well can you test that? If you're doing, 20-yard accelerations and jumps, are they giving maximal effort? Are you collecting that information at a time period that's the same and comparable across each of those time points? Are you cueing them the same way to get the same type of output from them in terms of the mechanics and in terms of their effort, in terms of how they're performing the actual movement, the actual task? And so I think that's what it boils down to, because we're never going to have a world where we get the control group. It's never going to be perfect. And that's, I saw this the other day. I'm not sure who tweeted it out to give credit, but I saw this somewhere. It was like applied sports science is really, trying to bring information, and I'm paraphrasing here, bring information or bring some clarity in a chaotic environment.
What's up, strength coaches? Want to take a quick break from the show to talk to you about our sponsor, Team Builder. Team Builder is your one-stop shop for online training platform needs as a coach. With Team Builder, you're going to be able to program for your athletes whether they're in person or remote. Using Team Builder, not only will you be able to program for your athletes, but there are special features such as the leaderboard and locking training with wellness questionnaires. With the leaderboard, you can have an exercise performed that day, whether it be a lift, a sprint, or a jump, and scores can be updated in real time and projected on a TV in the training. Wellness questionnaires can be used at the beginning of training, and your athletes will have to fill them out prior to being able to train. This ensures that as a coach, you're being able to collect quality data before the athletes train. So, if you're interested in Team Builder, click the link down below and find out more information. Let's get back to the show.
And the complexity and the chaos within our environment is what makes our job so fun. It's problem solving and trying to tease things out when nothing's in the most ideal or optimal state. Nothing is perfect. You're not in the laboratory. People are not going to do exactly like you're trying to come out and get information to help inform decision making in a chaotic environment where variables are constantly changing and you don't know what's going to be thrown at you day to day. And that's what makes your job, that's what drives you nuts, but that's also what makes it fun. And you're coming in there like, what problems do I get to solve today? How do I get to try to help prepare our athletes better? How do I help serve our athletes better? How do I help bring information to coaches in a more efficient and effective manner in this environment? That's what makes it, in my opinion anyway, and for me at least, that's what I think makes it so fun and challenging. No one, you love being in those challenging environments where you're trying to figure things out, and you're problem solving, and you're trying to, and from a scientist standpoint, like I've been in labs, like doing, I've been in the perfect laboratory settings and clinical settings in my doctoral training and my, in graduate school and things like that. And I love it, but what makes this setting so fun is that you're trying to test the effectiveness of something. You're trying to pick out change. You're doing testing in non-optimal conditions, and you're problem solving. You have to think outside the box. You have to think with how can I bring scientific method, and how can I bring ideal testing and measurement into a situation where it's, you're out on a field in the rain trying to collect information. Like, I mean, there's been all kinds of thinking back to things like, and it's, that's what I love, or a part of what I love about being an applied sports scientist. But
for anybody
sorry, I went off on a little.
No, you're good. Please don't apologize. Not at all. That's why we had you on the show. For anybody that is, new into the field and they're starting to learn more and more about this applied sports science roles, what would be some suggestions for anybody that wants to dive down that rabbit hole and do more and more with it? Like, because it is becoming more and more of these positions are getting hired. How do you recommend somebody go down that path?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I will say one thing. There's not like a one way. I think looking at my colleagues across the NFL, different sports, applied sports science, like come from many different backgrounds, whether it's some are strength conditioning coaches like myself. I was a strength conditioning coach. I came from more of a strength conditioning background in that I was getting academic training, but I did strength conditioning internships, mentored under some older school strength coaches. That technology was a stopwatch. And I learned so much from them, though, that I think still helps me today. And it was nothing from how operational technology, but just from like understanding how to deal with things that aren't ideal, and how to deal with athletic environments and sporting environments, and how to integrate things within strength conditioning. So I credit learning a lot from those individuals. But I think if you have an interest in applied sports science, what's great is that people think you need technology, or you think you need a catapult or whatever it is to do sports science or whatever, and that's just not the case. So I think whatever setting you're at, you can start understanding and applying. I mean, if you're a strength coach, you're a type of sports scientist. There's already incorporating sports science, understanding the physical demands of your sport and trying to prepare your athletes for that. So I think first and foremost, like trying to um, uh, uh, apply different concepts, measure things within your own environment, and bring more of the scientific processes into whatever environment you're at. Great resources are obviously there's the NSCA Essentials for Sports Science text. It's a good base manual of just giving you a very broad understanding of different concepts and things within sports science broadly. Monitoring athletes' performance from Mike McEwen is another excellent foundational textbook that goes over the basics of statistics, the basics of load response monitoring, concepts like that. So those are some great resources. I think just reaching out to people too. Like there's a lot of great applied sports scientists out there. I think reaching out and just having conversations, if you want to, if this is where you want your career to go, and let's say you're a strength conditioning coach now, or you're an intern in strength conditioning, or whatever it is, or you're a student in strength conditioning, I think really being able to start learning broadly across a lot of different areas initially. So learning S&C. So if you're learning a little bit about basic statistics, understanding how, what's all the way from, like, we know, okay, basics of understanding means and standard deviations. So measures of central tendency and variability, and then understanding like basic regression, understanding some of those basic techniques, understanding research methods is a big one that I think oftentimes doesn't get discussed as much. So, basic research methods textbooks that just understanding, essentially how to measure, test, and measure, and how to establish appropriate applied research questions, and then how to go about answering those in a way that provides the best information. And I can provide, I don't know if you have show notes, I could potentially give you some references if people are interested that they could look up. But then also from there, I would say there's a lot of great internships, a lot of great experiences available to now that weren't there even 3 years ago, to where you can get great experiences in terms of interning. I would say that if you're at a university or at a place where, let's say you're a strength coach at a place that doesn't have a sports scientist, I would just start doing sports science where you're at. And I know that was a little bit of how I got my first full-time job in sports science. Was I was basically doing my PhD and started being a sports scientist at Virginia Tech, and I was literally going door to door to people. I was interning as a strength conditioning coach and ended up, so I could coach on the floor, which is a great way. If you are a strength coach, you can already bring value in maybe a more understood way. But then if you can find that you're bringing value in other ways, that's sometimes how you get that first job, is it's created, because there are a lot of jobs out there, but a lot of places don't have them. And a lot of times that first position they have is created out of a situation where someone starts doing the work, and then eventually it gets recognized, and it gets titled that. Generally, a place isn't a university. I'll speak specifically to universities. Generally, they aren't creating the role and then doing a national search for that individual in that first sports science position. Most of the positions that have been created in collegiate environment, again, I'm speaking specifically collegiate here, have been created because someone started doing the work, and then that became a dual titled role. They transitioned into that role, whatever the case was, as opposed to, oh, we need this position from administration, and then they do a national search and go hire someone. And so I think that's a big one, wherever you're at, starting to do the work, because there's no better way to start, in my opinion, with that. And then finally, I would say that being just being up to date in research across a lot of different areas, and understanding different concepts from different areas. I love strength conditioning. I love weightlifting. But if I lived just in the weightlifting, strength training world, it wouldn't. It would ultimately make me very narrow-minded in my views. So I think being reading across a lot of different research in different disciplines and understanding whether it's biomechanics, physiology, sports psychology, reading literature regarding different instruments and testing, rehabilitation type stuff. Like I think that really helps round you out and give you a lot of great insight and into different areas and create linking information across different disciplines because ultimately as a sports scientist you might be housed in strength conditioning whatever the case is but to be really good at your job, in my opinion, you have to really be able to go across disciplines, work with different people. You have to be very involved with sports medicine. You have to understand
Yeah.
tissue specific healing. You have to understand the physiology behind injury. You have to understand different types of testing, which is linked back to S&C, understanding what types of exercises are going to be linked to different types of stresses and understanding what's going to be appropriate at different time points to work with athletic trainers and medical doctors and physical therapists to understand what tests might be appropriate based on their prescription, and then ultimately what those more advanced methods are going to be like when you're returning that athlete and they're farther along the continuum, more towards being returned to play. You want to return them to performance and you ultimately you want to make them more robust and resilient than what they were when they got injured in an ideal world. And so, under having a good understanding, knowledge base around different types of, of strength conditioning concepts, advanced programming concepts, different types of exercise selection around eccentric loading, isometrics, different types of joint angles, and what types of stressors those create to ultimately give an appropriate stimulus based on what that athlete needs. So being able to kind of interact across all these bases, I think you really need to have an understanding in several disciplines and be able to understand and have a I would say an adequate, at least entry level um, knowledge base around best practices and literature in these different areas so that you can at least have those conversations. And there's still times I'll go in and I'll have a conversation with a physical therapist or an MD or whoever it is, and they'll say something and I'll immediately go look something up afterwards and say, okay, some another area for learning.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. If you're not having those moments, you're in the wrong rooms, right? Like,
Exactly. Oh man, uh, that's uh, that's why I love working where I work now because man, like I'm surrounded by people that are just incredible practitioners in different areas, and every single day there's a conversation or an interaction I have with one of my colleagues where I'm like, they say something that makes me think, and I'm like, man, I gotta either look that up, read more about that, understand that better. Um, I really believe what you said is 100% accurate. Like you got to be in the rooms where you're learning, where you're challenged, where you're asked questions that sometimes you just don't know the answer to. You like, hey, like I'm not quite sure, and it challenges you to get better in an area, or you get challenged in your setting of like, how can we better serve this athlete? There's something that maybe someone brings up that's appropriate based on that circumstance, and you don't know much about it, or you can look at alternatives for it, like you being in those environments with people that are experts in different areas. I think that it's really the iron sharpens iron type of mentality of like you're going to get questioned. There's going to be times you feel stupid, and there's going to be times where you're humbled. But those are the environments that are fun. Those are environments that you look back on 10 years down the road, and you're like, man, like I got better when I was there.
speaking of looking back 10 years, if we take a look into strength and conditioning 5, 10 years ago, it's completely evolved, like you said, with these new high performance roles and working all together. Where can you envision the next 5, 10 years of this thing going in sports performance and human performance and whatever word you want to use?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say that we've seen this transition over the past, I'll say 5 to 7 years, where now strength coaches are expected, especially especially at like Power 5 universities, but I think all the way across really, like strength coaches are expected to have a different skill set than they did, again, 5 to 7 years ago. Like you continually see job postings with um, places hiring strength coaches where they want them to have some kind of knowledge base around basic statistics, basic reporting measures, and it's constant. I remember seeing the first time it was real evident is I remember I was in grad school and West Virginia football was hiring an assistant strength coach, and I saw the posting. I was, and what stuck out at me is that they wanted the person to have an understanding of statistics, and they wanted them to be able to have an understanding of data visualization. I had never seen that on a strength conditioning coach posting before, and so it was interesting. And then I just remember that was like the first time, and I don't remember what year that was, but it was several years ago. And ever since then, if you look, like more and more strength coaches are expected to have an understanding around that. In fact, there are strength coaches that if you're not adapting now to at least having an understanding to do it, and or having the understanding that you have to bring people in around you. Like if you're a head strength coach, now you're seeing strength coaches that are bringing people around them that, hey, if I don't have this skill set, I need to learn at least a basic enough amount, or learn a basic fundamental skill set here, or at least be able to evaluate these areas so that I can hire people around me that know these things, and then they can help me incorporate, whether it's catapult, whether it's force place, because places that are hiring are wanting to incorporate sports science technology. And I credit one of my mentors, Ben Hilgart, great example. Like he's, off the Joe Ken strength tree, like exceptionally bright, great coach. He's an individual that he continually adapts and gets better. And even though it was completely outside his element, like being able to learn about different forms of technology. I remember sitting in his office once a week. We'd go over just like small little things so that he was learning. He had me, and like he didn't need, but he wanted to learn just so that he could learn and keep adapting. And I think that's important. And I remember that was always, I had so much respect for him, and for the fact that he was always getting better, even though it was so far outside his realm of of knowledge and what he had done previously. And I think you're seeing more and more of that, of coaches that are adapting to learning more of those. So I think moving forward, you're going to see more and more coaches, or more and more positions requiring strength coaches to have skill sets around different areas, technology, statistics, data visualization in some ways, and an understanding and a want to incorporate those into their program. The other piece I think that you'll see, and you're seeing it now, is I think more and more programs will move to high performance models where you have strength conditioning falling under a high performance umbrella with sports science as a way to help incorporate more data and information into the decision making processes. And so you're seeing that now in the NFL. I, you're seeing forms of that in the college environment in different ways. Penn State's a great example of that now with their new high performance program. And Josh Nelson,
Yep.
buddy of mine, I was obviously up there with him, like his kind of role where he's essentially kind of a high performance director of Penn State football. The way he incorporates information, there is an applied sports scientist there that collects the day-to-day, week-to-week information and all that. But these high performance roles in the NFL, you're seeing that, whether it's the Jets, whether it's the 49ers, Ben Peterson, Brad Weiss, the Carolina Panthers, Andrew Altoff, you're seeing that more and more here in Houston with Matt Van Dyke. It's where you're having high performance directors with strength conditioning, nutrition, sports science falling under them. But ultimately, how that functions a lot of times is based around a way to help incorporate more data and information and across different disciplines to help holistic athlete development and to help incorporate information into a larger vision around performance and physical preparation. And so I think that's been driven a lot by sports science and technology, of why these are required now. We're used to, it was the head strength coach ran everything in terms of performance, in nutrition and really everything. I mean, used to the nutrition was basically under strength conditioning, and it and that was, I mean, I'm speaking more specific football world here, but that's, we've evolved, and I think you'll continue to see that, to where I think eventually you'll see collegiate football running more towards having like a high performance type director, with strength conditioning and sports science falling under them. Because as these departments grow too, I mean, you're seeing a lot of college football teams now. Used to, you say one sports scientist, now you're seeing them hire assistant directors of sports science for just football. Oklahoma is a good example of that. Brandon Stone doing a terrific job there. Just added that an assistant director of sports science there over the summer, and you're seeing that happen more and more places now. So as these departments grow, I think you're gonna kind of evolve to this world where you get high performance director to help bring people together, facilitate information across sports med, S&C, practice design and planning, and to help create more holistic athlete development and physical preparation within a overall sport performance type vision, long term. And so those are the two biggest ways I think that I see the field of area strength conditioning evolving over the next, let's say 10 years.
No, that's very concise, and I feel like you almost need all of those people working together, then funneling it to one person, so that one person can then almost translate that to work and talk with the coach. Because otherwise, a sport coach is going to feel overwhelmed. Like, when do I actually get to make a decision about the team that I coach? And it's not just driven by, oh, this number or this number or that number, because we've all seen coaches that get overly consumed by a certain number and they don't look at who the athlete is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yes, absolutely. I think that's where a lot of this too is, you're, we talk about force plates and we talk about these specific forms of technology. These, you're getting a lot of information from a lot of areas that ultimately need to be understood within the context of the whole athlete and their trajectory. And not only within, there was a great paper that actually just came out from Joe Clubb on key performance indicators, where also she focused on talking about process goals and the process of athlete development over time, as opposed to just being focused on one number or a physical key performance indicator or checkpoint. And I think that's key, because I think being able to incorporate all this information over a longer period of time and help paint a better picture around the athlete and within an appropriate context ultimately is going to serve the athletes better, to help be able to make sure they're getting what they need. And it's not just being looked through the lens of power, strength, any one number, and that they're actually getting served better with a longer term plan in mind.
What would be your biggest piece of advice for a coach that is getting new technology? We'd be like, hey, these are the first three things. Like, make sure you're not doing this. Like, anybody listening right now, they're like, okay, hey, I just got something, or I'm thinking about getting something. What would be your kind of like three do's and three don'ts? And the reason that I asked this question is that was always a question I had, to any whenever I was on an interview, like, hey, what's an example of three things for this role to be great, three to be bad? And I'd also just check in with the head coach every now and again, like, hey, what am I doing good? What am I doing bad? So I always like to use that as a barometer for anybody that does something new. Like, what do they got to make sure they do? What do they got to make sure that they never do?
Sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, you have to make sure, and I'll kind of pair these together. So you have to make sure in terms of your dues, that if you're getting new technology, do I have the personnel and the
Mm,
resources to manage this technology? And when I say manage, to define that, I mean collect the data, manage and store the data, and then report and visualize the data within your organization. So like making sure that that's something that can fit within the bandwidth. And I always like to say in that case, like a worst case scenario, because you
okay.
can't rely on somebody. So think about, if you're thinking about getting a tool and you're like, oh, my interns can do that. I always like to think about what a worst case scenario that you don't have any interns. Can you still collect that? Could you still use that technology? Could you still do it? And if not, then you probably don't have the appropriate personnel and resources there. If in your worst case scenario, what if this individual is going to do it? And okay, well, what if that person's not there? in that worst case scenario, could you still do it? If you can't, then I would say probably you don't have the appropriate personnel there.
Good
And
point.
I'll link that as a do to say a don't to that is don't sacrifice getting technology in place of getting people.
Mm.
People before technology all the time. And I'm saying that as someone who's like, I'm no bigger fan of sports science, technology, getting data and information and use it, but people over technology any day of the week. If you have limited resources and you don't have the people that you need, and you have the option. Sometimes you don't have the option, but I would always push for having the people versus technology. That's Josh Nelson. Like we would talk about this all the time at Penn State because we up there, we push for, they're all the time wanting to get new technology, new things up there. And for us, we had talked about it all the time. We're like, let's push for a new position, because we always want the people, the boots on the ground
Yeah.
before the new technology. And that's part of having an appropriate infrastructure in place to collect data, collect information, and be able to utilize it. So I would say the do is make sure you have and check the appropriate personnel and resources to manage it. And I would say, just me personally, I always think worst case scenario. Could on a worst case day, could I still do this? Can I still manage things? And then don't choose technology over people if you have the option of how to utilize those resources. Um, and then another one I would say a do is I would say make sure that whatever technology you're getting, before it ever gets there, before you ever purchase it, to just make sure there's a documented process or system in place of what questions is this information going to answer, what gap in knowledge is this filling, this technology, how is this technology's data going to be collected, how is that going to be repeated over time, if appropriate, how is that going to be scaled? So let's say you're getting catapult and your plan is to initially put it on 10 guys, but you want to use it on the whole team. Okay, how is that going to be done initially? And then how's that going to be scaled to the whole team if that's what I ultimately want to do?
Uh-huh.
And in collegiate athletics, sometimes it's scaled to different sports, depending on the environment. Like if you're a strength coach and work with multiple sports and you want a new technology to ultimately work with all the sports, like how is it going to be scaled? So the scalability of it. And then ultimately, or then next, the management of data. So you're collecting data. Let's say this technology requires you to collect data every week. How are you going to manage this data over time and do it in an appropriate way? So securely and cleanly, so that you can go back and do longer types of analyses on it. What is that plan going to be like? And then finally, how are you going to analyze it and report it in a way that doesn't take you away from from what you need to get done on a day-to-day basis, and that can be done in a way that makes it interpretable to help inform decision making, because ultimately that's the ultimate goal, is to help to make some more informed decisions around this information. So what's that process going to be like for analyzing it and reporting it in a based on whatever frequency, weekly, daily, whatever the technology is required to answer those questions. So I would say having all of that in place prior to ever purchasing the technology or it arriving, because that that is what you don't want to be in. And this is the don't on this one, is the technology to get there, and then you're scrambling, figuring out, how do I use this? How do I collect it? What am I going to do with it? Like, what metrics should I look at? And because then you're in a lot of times what happens in practice is that this gets put onto a lower level strength coach if you're in football,
Yes.
and then they're scrambling because they don't want to disappoint their superior, even though they haven't been properly prepared and they're being put in a position to fail. And then I can't tell you how many assistant strength coaches in football, and right now a lot of them come from G5, that I'm getting calls from, texts from, hey, can you we just got three force plates. I don't know what to do. Can you talk with me? How can I use this data? How can I use this information? What metrics should I look at? I'm like, okay, we gotta, and but it's you,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're,
You're right. No,
they're,
you're right. Yeah.
they're stressed and they're trying to figure out, they're like, and it's funny. One of them said, well, now I've been made the sports scientist. So the sports scientist on the staff. And well, if you don't, that's great. But if you don't already have been prepared
Yeah.
to do that task, you're being put in a position to fail. And so I think it's important to have all those questions answered prior to introducing the technology to, if you're to be able to put you and your staff in a good position to be able to utilize the information. Because again, you don't want to be there scrambling, trying to figure out what is this technology going to be? How can we use this information in the technologies there? You're testing your athletes and you don't really know what you're going to do with the information. And then then you're requiring your athletes to do things that aren't necessarily tied to some type of how are we going to do this? How are we going to use this information? Um, and then finally, I would say um, appropriately vetting the technology within not only the company, but also within the literature. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of technology that'll come out that has no evidence base behind it. And that's okay if you can link it to some type of, you can't always wait for a full body of research to come out before doing something, but it should be linked to some type of like physiological mechanism or rationale that makes sense, that's rooted somewhere in some type of mechanistic, at least literature. You don't necessarily need a meta-analysis saying that, or like randomized controlled trials of utilizing a technology to be able to say, okay, this is appropriate. But at the same time, you should at least vet it somewhat throughout. What do they say? What are they saying this does? And if this is filling some kind of gap in knowledge and this technology is going to do that, great. But if there's not research around it and they can't, then, and you can't link it to some type of physiological rationale, like this is what they're saying it does and how it does it is appropriate based on my understanding of physiology or whatever it is, then there's something's not right. And I wouldn't waste your money on it, because there's other types of technology that could probably bring benefit and that actually have evidence around them and their efficacy. And so I think that's just something to kind of consider. And again, the don't on this one, pairing the don't on this one is, I would say you don't want to just listen to a rep, because you'll get, and whatever they tell you, take it as the gospel and then run with it and start utilizing it on your athletes, because you're the safeguard to your athletes. Like,
Ooh.
you could bring anything in there and they're going to, they trust you, or
Yep.
hopefully they trust you. And they're going to say, okay, like if you're telling me this is appropriate, then you have my best interest in mind. You vetted, they trust that you vetted it. This is good for them. This is beneficial. Whatever information you're gaining from this is going to be utilized to help protect them and help make them better in terms of performance. And so you're their safeguard. And so making sure that you properly vet this technology, and that when you bring it in, all the homework's been done. And that I think is very important, because you don't just want to bring it in and you're trusting whatever rep that's whatever they're telling you, and then you're just running it with it, because I think that is obviously is putting you and your athletes in a bad position.
How long is too long to be in the data collection mode? Because when you first get something, like you're essentially just data collection. Like, okay, we're going to get some force plates. Well, you got to see where your guys are at. Or even with catapult, you can't just get data and be like, oh, these numbers were high and It's like, no, you need to start to see, like, okay, what is it? It's always an N of one within the team. Like, it might be longer than coaches are comfortable with, in my opinion. What, like, because it's like, I remember when we first got catapult, he's like, what do these numbers mean? I was like, these are our numbers for right now. I'm not making recommendations right now. We're just going to collect data and see. And then in a year, because we've actually, like, and then, but let's see if we actually keep your same scheme. Let's see how we continue to evolve this. Like, it's a work in progress. It's not just me being like, brah, brah, brah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. Um,
Yeah, like, so what, with that being said, what would you recommend? Like, how
yeah,
long do you think? Like, is it shorter? Is it longer? Is it balancing the fact of how quickly do you have to win? Like, what is it?
I mean, I think it's obviously dependent upon the type of technology, what questions you're trying to answer with it. I would say that if you're in your example, and that's the one you hear a lot, is we got Catapult, we got Stat Sport, whatever type of
What does it
positional
mean?
tracking system. We get this output of load numbers, of speed, high speed running numbers, all these different things, and being able to say, okay, what does this mean? How do you utilize it? Well, to your point, I think in terms of from a head coach standpoint of practice design, things like that, you do have to collect it a little bit because scheme, practice structure, so many things can influence um, those numbers and those outputs, especially if you're looking at team averages, positional averages, which generally coaches want that. You'll have individual numbers, but coaches want to but they immediately want to say, okay, what did my team do today? And educating them around what these metrics mean and how they can be influenced very easily by certain factors is important. But I think to answer your question specifically is immediately what you can do is create, and this is right out of the gate, is be able to create kind of movement profiles for your guys based on the physical demands of the positions and within your coaching staff scheme. And so that's something that pretty quickly, depending what time of year, if you're in season, it's great because in season is pretty much the same.
That's what you
And
want. Yeah.
and so you can say, okay, coach, like this is the profiles for our guys and picking the metrics that make sense based on the position. So for your skills, you can put, high speed running numbers, sprinting numbers, things like that. I generally like if positional, generally use like 20 plus, 18 plus, 15 plus, and categorize it like sprinting, high speed running, moderate speed running, things like that for skills. And that's absolute. And then obviously track relative at the individual level relative to their maximal velocity.
That's a good
But
point.
like creating movement profiles to say, this is average, what our weekly average is for our wide receiver position group for 18 plus yardage.
Yeah.
And the reason that's one, it's giving the coach some immediate information to give them an idea. It's not going to be actionable really immediately. Like they're not going to make any immediate decisions or using that information most likely, but it's information you can provide them that's actually, oh, this is the profile of our guys. Now, how this could be immediately used is, let's say you have an injury to a wide receiver. And so let's say grade 2 hamstring. So it's going to keep them out a little bit, but not, again, time course there 2-3 weeks, let's say. Okay, so it's going to take them out to where they're not going to lose a lot of their chronic loading. Like they're not going to be deconditioned broadly from a football standpoint, but they're going to lose they're going to lose their exposure to higher velocities, power, rate of force development, those types of qualities within, if it's 3 weeks within that time frame. So having an understanding around what their weekly demands are that they're going to be put under when they return, you can reverse engineer that process with an injured player using that information you just gained to help systematically build out what progressions might make sense based on their injury to get them back to those numbers. And at the same time, you might say then to the coach, hey, like we got this guy coming back. This is probably around the average they're going to be exposed to. Maybe we want to think on limiting reps for his first week back a little bit, understanding that he's going to be building up in a controlled, non-chaotic environment with our sports med and then return to a chaotic, non-controlled environment in football. We probably want to reduce his physical output because generally those injuries, if it's a hamstring in this particular case, soft is probably going to happen in high speed running under fatigue or deceleration, but either way, most likely under fatigue. So let's limit maybe the reps a little bit to keep that number down. And again, like this is just, I'm giving an example here of maybe like this could be used across different injuries, like, but immediately conceptually based, you can create movement profiles and then use that information immediately to help return an athlete to the physical demands, prepare them for the physical demands that they're going to have based on their position group in this case. And this could be, if you've had the technology for a month, you could do this. And so that's something immediately. And that's why also I say that it's important to have good relationships and an understanding across these different disciplines, because a lot of times in the strength conditioning world, if you're bringing in technology, the way you're going to bring the most value initially is in collaboration with sports med in return to performance.
Yes.
And
Amen to that. Yep.
that value is extremely important, not only for helping get that technology understood and how it can be utilized in that context, but also creating an understanding from administration around the value of that information. Because it's one thing to talk about performance and power and speed and practice, but it's another thing if you're getting into the medical world and talking about being able to better return athletes from injury. that's where, at least from my experiences, administration, their ears perk up
Yeah.
and they're seeing more of like, okay, this is something that adds value in the athletics department.
And it speaks dollars and cents because it's like, hey, if somebody gets hurt, that's money, that's surgeries, and it's like, hey, if we could do this and then eventually spend less money on surgeries in the back end, like it helps them understand the dollars and cents of, why they did what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a whole, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's, and when you're getting into the collegiate environment and you're initially, people are having difficulty understanding why you need these technologies and what a sports scientist does. This is a great way to introduce them to some of the fundamental concepts around, why you care about measuring external load, or these load metrics, and why you care about how an athlete's responding to that given load, and why you need that information. How's it going to be utilized? And that's a quick, to your point, the timeline. That's a quicker way to see return on that investment, and to see it utilized, to help inform decision making processes.
Do you think there's going to be more and more of these roles eventually where it's like you're almost the speed sports scientist because of like the number of things that a 1080 can put out, and then it like, is it going to get that hyper focused to down to almost not the device, but like what the device is trying to measure, whether it's strength, power, speed, total on-field work? Like, could it evolve that much with all the different people and I'm talking now high level for the sports that have the bigger budget for it, but because if you can do it, why not, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely gonna get to the point where I wouldn't say you're gonna have necessarily a speed sports scientist, but I think you're gonna have staffs that have a speed specialist, and then they might be more apt to hire a sports scientist with more of a biomechanics speed background,
Maybe,
and
yeah.
or have a speed development coach. We're fortunate here to have Ryan Grubbs as director of speed development, and I work a lot with him in different ways. He's a phenomenal coach, period, but obviously his expertise around speed development, is next to none. And so he's our speed expert. And then utilizing the technology, the 1080s, as far as data collection and things like that, like, that's managed, in my department, with my staff. But like at the same time, it's not in isolation, like everything we do. And I'm saying the 1080 is kind of the entry point of what they did over, but obviously, like, we're getting in that world now, even of the kinematics piece,
Ooh, yeah.
of being able to like understand, okay, what they did in terms of output, but also the strategy they utilized to do
How
that
to get there.
output.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just like you think about on a force plate, right? It's
Jump height,
whatever they
velocity.
did.
Yeah.
Exactly. What was their counter movement depth? What did they do eccentrically and unweighting and braking? How did they do in the transition? And then the propul like it's painting the picture of what they did, sure, but how did they do it? Same deal with sprinting. And so now with kinematics pieces and things, you can have at least a 2D understanding, and then eventually 3D understanding, um, depending if you incorporate other technology there that's available, into how they achieve what they did, over, a fly or a 20-yard acceleration or whatever it is. And so I think, to your point, you, organizations are going there now. And I think you're going to have someone on staff, whether it's a strength coach who's a speed expert that has a fundamental understanding of the biomechanics around it and can apply that information, linking it to data collection, and then the interpretability, using it to coach from the mechanics standpoint, and to program from an S&C standpoint to address anything you're going to see if they are using, okay, they have, poor reactivity in ground contact time. They spend too long on the ground, or they whatever you're seeing from a kinematic standpoint that maybe is going to predispose them to being in disadvantageous positions in movement. You're going to address that or intervene. And so having the understanding of someone on your staff who can link the information from the data being captured to actionability intervention points, whether it's coaching mechanics and cueing, whether it's weight room intervention, whether it's plyometrics, whatever issue you're addressing, I think that person, whatever they're housed as, I think you're going to see more and more of those folks getting hired. Absolutely. And I think that's especially for sports that are field based. And again, I'll speak specifically here in American football, but you're definitely getting to that point where I wouldn't be surprised if that's just you keep seeing these experts in speed. A lot of places have them now, but I think it'll almost be like the norm that someone is going to be and I say speed development, but again, not only knowing how to coach, but understanding how to take the data information and link that. That's what makes Ryan so great. There's a lot of great speed coaches out there, but what makes Ryan great is that he can coach it, but he also understands to link the data of what he's seeing and like how to use data and information. And like he can walk that continuum to be able to ultimately get some type of response and change in his intervention to understanding what's going on in the data, how to collect the data. And that's what makes him so great at being, a speed development coach and practitioner around biomechanics, is because of his understanding across that spectrum, so to speak. And I think those are the types of individuals that you're going to see, I think, more and more at higher level organizations, even P5s that have those budgets around that. I think you'll see people hired. I know right now, if someone put me in director of sports science at a major college football program, and I was starting a position there, I would be immediately, depending who was on S&C staff, if there wasn't someone in that area that understood the data side of it too, because I think that's a piece that you can really move the needle. And plus, let's face it, like if you're working with football coaches, making athletes faster and being able to communicate, like
Yeah.
that's going to
Yep.
move the needle for them.
Oh,
That
100%.
just is.
For as I personally continue to nerd out on this topic, I know that you can overlay game film with what happened on the actual, desktop with your catapult. Is there a way that you eventually will be able to capture a 1080 rep and then be able to overlay like the visual of the rep with what the data is outputting, or is that not possible yet? And again, I'm saying, is that like foreseeable in the future, possibly?
I mean, I think it will be. We do not have, I mean, and I'm speaking here, like we don't do anything like that. But I mean, as far as I'm not sure the technology there around that in terms of like if there are places that are moving towards that, or if that's possible right now. That's kind of beyond the scope of something that I'm aware of. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, and to be honest, I think ultimately you're going to get away from even the catapult units to where it's
Ooh,
video technology
yeah.
down the line. I think the units are going to be obsolete eventually. But again, that's just if I had to put money on it, I would think we'd eventually in the next, I don't know if I would put the time, but I'd say probably 10, 12 years,
I mean,
be
it's
moving away from
interesting you
that.
say that though, because what Craddock said at that football conference 2 years ago, down at whatchamacallit, at A&M, they're able to like take a recruit's film, be able to break it up frame per second, and be able to talk about how well of an accelerator they are by using the frames per second of somebody's recruit film. And so that kind of leads into what you're saying, where like maybe you don't need the GPS monitored anymore because the film has become so breakdownable with the frames per second.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
no, I appreciate. I've taken up a lot of your time. I appreciate you sharing and helping educate myself and the other strength coaches. You have a game in 2 days, so best of luck against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And again, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing and being honest. I told you before, you got a Houston Texans fan in me, brother. So keep kicking some butt.
I appreciate it, Justin. And if anyone wants to reach out or anything, like I'm, social media, email, anything like that. And Mark T. Lewis on Twitter, Instagram, and then my email, Dr. Mark Lewis at Gmail. If you want to reach out, connect. I'm always more than happy to chat about training, sports science, data, anything like that. And I always like talk shop and connect with people. And so if anyone wants to reach out, interested in chatting, anything like that, I'm always happy to do that.
Sounds good, man. Have a great, excuse me. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Appreciate it.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.